morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the Talent Company's webinar this morning. Today's webinar will be moderated by Liane Taylor of the Talent Company and will introduce our exceptional panel of leaders to discuss the critical business imperatives of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. My name is Marion Tripp, and I am the Customer Engagement and Experience Manager with the Talent Company. As many of you know, and for those who aren't familiar, the Talent Company is an HR consulting organization focused on recruitment, total rewards, HR on demand, leadership development, coaching, and career transition. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over some housekeeping with you. Today's webinar is scheduled to last 60 minutes, plus Q&A. All participants will be muted to enable the facilitators and panel to present without interruption. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Technical questions can be submitted via the chat, also at the bottom of your screen. And you will receive the session recording and an evaluation survey within the next 2 days. Now, without further delay, I'm very pleased this morning to introduce Liane Taylor. Liane Taylor is the practice leader for leadership and career engagement and works with the Talent Company's team of coaches, facilitators, and consultants to bring programs to the clients they work with, spanning onboarding, coaching, leadership, and talent development. She has spent over 10 years in HR consulting, is a certified coach, and has a master's in industrial organizational psychology. Please join me this morning in welcoming Liane Taylor.
Thank you so much, Marion. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here and to welcome to all of our attendees and panelists on the call today. I speak on behalf of the Talent Company that this is a really important event and one that we were quite honored and excited to host. And it's certainly important because as we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's been an important topic for years, but certainly has become on the forefront of the work that we do, and very much rightfully so. And so when we think about why it's so important, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging touches all elements of HR and has such an important impact on the work that we do. When we think about how we're going to speak to this topic today, it's important to emphasize that we will touch on all elements. So certainly looking at diversity and how do we look at creating a broad range of representation across the workplace, equity, including our systems and policies and how we make sure we have equity set up across the organization, inclusion, which looks at what are some of the efforts that we can make as an organization or as individuals to create a more inclusive culture. And lastly, and really importantly, belonging, which is really from the eye of the beholder. So how are individuals feeling in terms of their sense of empowerment, inclusion, and support from the people in the organizations around them. So I'm really excited, and in a moment or two, I will introduce our panelists today that bring a broad range of perspective. And recognizing this topic serves two really important purposes. So first, above all else, it's a humanity cause. So looking at creating workplaces that are positive and inclusive. And secondly, there's certainly a business imperative. So as we look at research and the power of not only diversity, but inclusion in workplaces, we can clearly demonstrate the impact on performance and innovation. And in fact, McKinsey has some great research that talks about those organizations that are of the 25% most diverse can actually deliver upwards of 33% higher returns from a performance perspective. So clearly the two together represent why this is such an important topic and why it is so well attended today. So thank you so much. Lastly, the two caveats I want to share today is first looking at what we mean by diversity. And it's important to emphasize that while we may touch on certain components, we certainly recognize that diversity is a broad topic and speaks certainly to some of the social justice issues that are important and historic in nature, looking at Black Lives Matter, looking at race, ethnicity, gender, and certainly the impact of the pandemic on gender, neurodiversity, and in looking at gender as well as other considerations, including the LGBTQ and all of the impacts in the broader sense of diversity. The second caveat that I want to make sure we talk about today is not to underscore how deep and broad this topic is. So we will spend an hour touching on some really important themes and advice from our esteemed panelists, but recognize that it is a long game. And while we'll talk about some short-term and long-term strategies, one approach does not fit all and certainly warrants a broader discussion on how we can implement some of these policies that we'll talk about today. So I hope that helps from a context setting. And from a process perspective today, what we'll start off with some high-level introductions for our panelists today. We'll then have each of our panelists spend about 5 minutes talking about their perspective and areas of expertise. And then we'll go into some rapid fire questions. We have some questions prepared, and certainly we'll look for some of your questions through the Q&A feature as well. And then we'll close off with some invitations for some of our upcoming events. And we have some great resources that have been provided by our panelists that we will absolutely follow up with you today. So through the Q&A, I'd love to hear a hello from those that are on the call today. Please keep your questions coming. If we don't get to them in the moment, we will absolutely make sure we have an opportunity to get to them towards the end of our session today. And we'll make note of them if there's any we don't get to, that there'll hopefully be an opportunity to come back to you after the session. Great. So without further ado, I'm absolutely honored and thrilled to introduce this diverse panel today. And when I say diverse, I mean from the perspective that they offer. And so we have Dr. Rob Cross, if you want to give a wave to the group here, who brings 20 years of research really looking at networks in an organization and how those networks can impact our sense of how we acknowledge, reward, and succession plan with the people around us, but certainly how we create a more inclusive culture. We have Laura Williams, if you want to give a hello today. And Laura brings not only the legal element to diversity and inclusion, but also brings a consulting lens, looking at different policies, practices, ways in which you can investigate issues, etc. So thrilled to have you on the call as well. Anjana, if you want to give a wave to our audience today. Anjana brings a deep experience from the corporate perspective and can talk about some of the initiatives she's undertaken in an organization to look at diversity inclusion in a really different way. So we'll look forward to her perspective today. And lastly, we have Andrea Carter. So Andrea, if you want to say hello. And Andrea brings in-depth research in looking at belonging and how it shows up from a neuroscience perspective, as well as different strategies that organizations can take to really consider what belonging means and how it can show up in the workplace. So thank you. So let's dive in. Up first, we have Laura. And I mentioned a high-level introduction of Laura. She does have her own legal and consulting practice. And most interestingly has a podcast that she's recently launched called WTF, and brings really great perspective and certainly is sought after in the climate that we're in. So Laura, without further ado, I'd love to have you share with our audience today your perspective on this really important topic.
Thank you so much, Leanne, and thank you for inviting me. I'm so honored to join this panel. These discussions and these conversations we're having right now are so critical. And I'll say for me, I mean, as much as I'm a contributor and a participant to this discussion, I always learn. So I'm looking forward to this session. One small little refinement in the introduction. My podcast is We Thrive Forward, but you know that the acronym does stand for WTF. I was trying to be subtle, but not so subtle because...
Oh, out there.
Well, and you know what? Because we do find ourselves in a very, to be euphemistic, peculiar time. You know, we've been sucker punched by a pandemic, and in the midst of being sucker punched by the pandemic, which made us all very raw in every respect, then we had the flagrant kind of instance of injustice with George Floyd's murder on May 25th, which, you know, as much as I'm such a, you know, not in terms of, there's no real silver lining when somebody passes, particularly under those circumstances, but the fact that it happened during a time where we were less distracted has really put us in a different moment in time. And this is a really important moment in time, and that's why having these conversations are so just critical. Because I can tell you, as an employment law practitioner, so I have two firms, Williams HR Law, and that's a full service law firm, and we focus on advice and representation for employers. I also have an HR consulting firm, Williams HR Consulting, but one of the main activities that takes up most of my time right now is my work as a workplace investigator. So I've always been engaged for the past 20 some odd years, more intensely in recent years, to conduct workplace investigations where there's been allegations of any type of misconduct. 2016 to 2019, a lot of it was sexual harassment, resulting from Me Too. Now we are in a different moment where you have organizations faced with what I call the kind of a hell no uprising. And I say that somewhat tongue in cheek, but right now employees are not willing and prepared to tolerate any perceived injustice or unfairness that they've encountered in the workplace. And I have never been busier, and the work is complex. As before, it was more organizations reactively because they faced exposures related to human rights, health and safety with respect to harassment, and discriminatory harassment as well under the code, workplace safety and insurance, and that really caused them to embrace equity and inclusion issues when there were complaints in the workplace. As well as, yes, there's a case that's been made for years that we have to embrace diversity because it's good for innovation and it's important just to be competitive. But we're in a different time now. Organizations feel compelled, pressured to step forward and to take a stand. And, they have to be cautious. And I know we're going to get into this when we speak a little bit more in depth in the context of the panel. But right now, you have the pressures that employees are putting on employers with respect to, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And employers needing to take a good, hard look at their systems, their policies, their practices, and because right now, if you're not focused on diversity and inclusion and equity issues, you're really going to find yourself flat-footed. So again, I'm very honored to be part of this discussion because it's one that we need to have. And just with respect to We Thrive Forward, one of the things I will say, because this is such a huge topic for the time that we have, is there is an episode that gives guidance to organizations with respect to kind of what are the considerations that you need to bear in mind when you're embracing and considering these issues in the workplace context.
Thank you, Laura. And I'm curious, when you think about the work that's keeping you busy, are there some high-level recommendations you might offer organizations that are just scratching the surface on this? What sort of advice might you offer?
The advice I would give first and foremost is don't feel pressured to just take a position without thinking it through. And meaning that a lot of organizations right after May 25th, early June, were, doing kind of social media campaigns about not tolerating certain types of misconduct. And in many instances, it backfired. Why? Because employees were calling the organization out saying, well, not so fast. My experience in this organization has been such. Right? I've been discriminated against. There have been barriers, systemic, institutional, subtle, flagrant, that have impeded my progress within this organization and really impaired my sense of fulfillment. And I love that we're going to be talking about belonging too, because that is something that it needs to be a part of the discussion. So my advice I've given, and that's why I referred to even the podcast episode, which gets some deeper depth in terms of this, is you've got to be intentional, authentic, transparent, vulnerable, and accessible, right? You have to have a different mindset when you embrace equity, diversity, and inclusion, because what was happening, that has been happening for years, is a lot of organizations get overly zealous. Their intentions and their understanding of the complexity of the content isn't there yet, and they try to ramrod programming into organizations. And when they do so, there's a lot of backlash. So it really have to be intentional. Get yourself educated. Make sure that whatever you're putting in place aligns with the realities within the workplace, as well as the experiences that that employees have had, and even your strategic planning, your longer term vision of where you want to go as an organization. So lots to say on that front, but I'll stop there in the interest of not taking all the airtime.
Well, we're compelled, absolutely. And Laura, I will ask, because I know part of the demand is really looking at how do you educate organizations on the topic of unconscious bias, and how do we create a culture that's more inclusive in nature. What are some of the requests you're seeing, and any sort of initial advice you might offer organizations that are considering such initiatives?
The advice I would give, particularly for organizations that are embarking on their journey, is they really need to just take a moment and really get in touch with the experience, as I mentioned before, and the realities within their own environment, and educate yourselves, right? I mean, individuals that or groups that share characteristics aren't all the same as well, right? So really you have to understand there's a lot of complexity here. There's a lot of complexity to the behaviors as well. When we talk about microaggressions and the types of behaviors that are more subtle and less flagrant. I need to not put Bailey's in my coffee. Flagrant. The reality is that a lot of workplace policies, they don't have the filter when it comes to inappropriate behaviors to really regulate and respond to the types of behaviors that cause hurt, cause harm, are discriminatory, and the law as well isn't right now set up to catch some of those more subtle behaviors. There's a lot of education that has to take place. But there's another thing that organizations really should focus on, and this is why I really love that we're focusing on belonging as well as the EDI theme. And that's when I do a lot of what I do is training, and a lot of organizations have said, listen, you know, help us help ourselves. So I always start with the leadership team because this is really a top-down. Approach. I mean, it has to be right at the top, and the appropriate behaviors have to be modeled at the top, and everyone has to be aligned at the top. So one of the things that I really stress to socialize is when it comes to the workplace, we're never going to get it 100% right? But if you have, if you socialize within teams within the workplace, a way of thinking, a mindset that we intend each other well, and that we acknowledge that we're all different. I haven't walked in the other person's shoes, they haven't walked in mine. So we have to accept the fact that there is a very high prospect we are going to offend each other. Now, if you've really properly gotten the team to congeal around the idea that we intend each other well, then defaulting to that thinking, we should be able to, at many times when the behaviors are truly unintentional and unwitting, to at least have an opportunity to informally resolve misunderstanding and offense without everything escalating to becoming a major investigation, and which can in and of itself be a bit of a trauma to an environment, right? Because at the end of an investigation, parties aren't happy. So in the theme of and along the thinking of belonging, really making a team understand that if we're truly a team, we meet each other well, because of our differences, we're going to have discussions sometimes where we educate each other, right? And that really is, as far as I'm concerned, the bedrock of being able to then overlay really good EDI programming that can be successful.
Yeah, I love that. And so the comment there is avoid those knee-jerk reactions. Take a broader view, look at the systems in place, how they align to what you're intending to achieve. And what I'm hearing, and I know many of the other panelists will comment in the same regard, is take time to really understand.
Yes, and listen.
Space and listen.
And listen.
Certainly for each of us, our identity is multitude. So one truth is not the same for the other. So I think that's fantastic advice. And certainly, you know, when you look at different programming, you know, there's a lot to be said about how our people practices, how we train leaders need to be broad in nature in terms of that curiosity, taking time to be good listeners, et cetera. So I think that's excellent advice.
And Leanne, just one last thing that's very important that a lot of organizations don't enable employees to do well is communicate, right? And training on how to have challenging conversations, because moving through this content, moving through this reality of equity, diversity, and inclusion and belonging, you really have to equip people to be able to communicate with one another. And so communications training is really important.
Thank you. Very helpful. Great way to kick us off, Laura. Dr. Rob, would love to hear from you, and your perspective is certainly looking at the networks and organizations. I'll kick it over to you.
Right. So that's obviously my entry point into this is as analytically kind of working through a whole host of organizations over the past 2 decades, where what I do is go in and map who's interacting with whom, who's collaborating with whom, who is getting energy from whom, different dimensions of connectivity that we can look at groups of 10, 15, 20,000 if we're kind of attaching things to, say, engagement surveys or things like that. And so the lens is, a unique one in the sense that you can actually start to see to what degree are people being pulled into networks and getting into positions that either are more influential or more replicating of what high performers are doing, and start to think about kind of both organizational aspects of belonging and also the individual experiences of it, which are very much, in my mind, locally driven by the interactions that you're having in different ways. And so it's a unique lens, right? But it's, in my mind, of course, is the boy with a hammer. It's an important one because we spend so much time in collaborative activity today. If I ask most people on this call, how much time do you spend each week on the phone, on email, or in meetings, right? Zoom or other formats. For most of us, it's 85–90% of our time is in some form of collaborative activity. And that's ratcheted up about 5 to 8 hours a week as we've gone through COVID. So what this has helped us do is begin to see, in these analytics, different elements of diversity. We've had our most success in the programs of the consortium that I run, the Connected Commons, in looking at gender diversity initially. And I'll come back to that, Laura. I loved your point about the way that the George Floyd, as hideous as the experience is, it opened up a floodgate for me, because for 10 years I'd been asking for ethnicity data from all these companies, and I got blocked by the attorneys constantly without knowing it, right? I was the really interested academic saying there's things we can do to help, and then the attorneys would kind of block things until recently, and it just opened up a floodgate of organizations willing to share this information and think about kind of that element of inclusion as well. And so what we've seen, most the bigger piece of our work we've been able to do has been around looking at successful women in networks, because organizations have been willing to share that. And it helps me start to see what's happening in the connectivity locally for those individuals that just do better over time. If we define success, and I think that's a real question to think about, really, what is success? Is it just getting to a certain point in different organizations? But if we define it that way and say what's differentiating the successful women from those that don't in terms of how they're connecting in networks, it has to do with establishing a broad network, early stage problem solving, avoiding stickiness in connection. So if we look over time, women are more likely to persist in relationships than men, for example, and there's a real strength to that. But if you're in a high velocity context where the needs around you change, the connections you need to lean on, it can slow you down, right, in certain ways. And that's kind of what I find in all this, is that there's a positive and a detriment depending on the context. And we also find that women, for example, absorb more of the collaborative demands in these networks. And so if over time there's 10–15% more asks coming to that category of person, right, they have to find ways to become more efficient in how they're dealing with that. So I've had a huge program of work going on in the consortia for about the past 10 years around what I call collaborative overload, and what we can see the more efficient collaborators do that buy back 18 to 24% of their time. So we've had a lot of really neat success in thinking about what are the behaviors that we're seeing, that we don't just go to that person and say, you need to go do this, but you situate that behavior in the context of the leader, the talent processes, the individual, right? And you create it as a condition for kind of everybody to engage in ways that's been super successful. And as we've been able to overlay the ethnicity data on top of this, it's opened up, similar kinds of insights to see, what can we understand about how people are moving into these connections more quickly, if they're more successful in getting promoted more rapidly or things like that. And again, create conditions where those behaviors are taught and encouraged from all dimensions, not just the individual, but from the team leader. It's things that kind of everybody's doing. So what I'm finding with the work in general is it is opening up a lot of opportunities at that level, and it's changing how members of my consortium are thinking about number one, implicit bias training. Now, we've, from a network standpoint, the sociologists have called this homophily for years, so it takes different forms. But what's interesting to me is that when we start to look at it over time, we start to see that people are more willing sometimes than we realize to change their initial impression, right? We have this knee-jerk reaction that looks for similarity. And a lot of times we're left with the impression from the cognitive psychology studies that never changes. When we look at it in the networks, we actually see that people do. And if we can create these conditions of more rapid cycles of experience that build trust, and do certain things in networks that, you've got a really nice twofold effect. You focus on reducing bias, but it's a hard thing to do, right? Tacit process and everything else. But then you come around the other side and say, here's other things we can do in the network. We're finding it's having a lot to do in terms of how people think about mentoring programs. So oddly enough, in these databases that we have, we would ask, who are you getting mentoring advice from? And what we found really paradoxically is people that had more mentoring connections to senior people actually left earlier in places. If they had more mentoring connections locally, people closer to the work and what was going on, that was a real kick towards kind of productivity, early inclusion, things like that. And so it doesn't say you don't have a mentoring context, but it suggests maybe instead of taking the formally high people, you take the well-connected people, right? And there's something happening in there that kind of draws people in. And then the other big thing we're seeing is just the ways of using this information to strengthen ERG investments and ways you can start to see which kinds of communities are actually forming really rapidly. What can you learn from them and replicate, but also not to get too overly focused on the ERGs. Because one thing we know, if you go back to what I was saying, is it's a broad network, early stage problem solving. It's the second biggest predictor of success we've seen. And so the ERGs sometimes can promote too much conformity, right? Or too much similarity. Let me say it that way. If that's all people do, right? It needs to be a little bit of a balance in there that we see as being successful. So early stages in all of this, like I said, because we just, companies wouldn't share the information with us for so long, but I'm so enthused about where I think this can go in terms of offering different opportunities and a really productive, positive dialogue in the organizations that are working on some of these ideas.
I think that's terrific. And, the amount of times we're working with organizations and they reach out to say, we recognize that performance processes, the way in which we succession plan, the way in which we promote are riddled with bias. And I think a part of that is our archetypes for success are somewhat dated and one-dimensional. So how do we look at organizations and really empower from a career perspective and identify talent that's more diverse in nature? And so, Rob, when we met through the Institute for Productivity, I really was fascinated in the work that you're doing with Connected Commons. So I'm just curious, as one last question to you before we move on to Anjana, what can organizations do with this research, or what can they do with that network analysis to help, really persuade the ways in which they're embracing talent and identifying a diverse talent pool?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, at a strategic level, you can, run the analytics and see, are we getting true inclusion? And in my mind, I love what Laura said. You start to see that there's a lot of differences in here. When you start overlaying ethnicity and gender, you see a lot of subcultures, and the breakdowns are not just happening between, for example, the white male and the rest of the group. It's happening in a lot of different places where people are approaching interactions differently, and creating that space that kind of, looks at that and thinks about it, I think is a really powerful, opportunity. Second thing for me is really in these micro behaviors. What we can find in all of this is there's 3 or 4 things that people do when they transition into networks. If they do things that create demand on their capabilities, establish competence-based trust before benevolence, create energy in the interaction, they always get pulled in. And I find a lot of times our mechanisms from an HR standpoint, when we think about people entering either organizations or moving between groups or things like that, it's always go build your brand, go sell yourself, right? Go tell people what you've done. And what we're finding today is that notion has really changed. It's actually people that get pulled in that are much, much more successful. And you can, again, I think, teach those behaviors, not just to the individual, right? But you kind of hold the whole system accountable for it, right? And if you do that well, I believe we'll see in the companies that are working with us right now, we'll start to see some pretty cool metrics. My hope, that we're putting time into.
I think that's fantastic. And like many policies, you want to look at the organizational lens, the leader lens, and the individual lens, which is what you're speaking to. Right. Thank you so much. Anjana, I'm thrilled to introduce you. So as the National Director of Organizational Development at CBI Health, and you bring, which is terrific, a broad industry background. So working with not-for-profits, for-profits, organizations of various sizes, unionized, not. And you certainly bring the lens of talent acquisition, the HRBP lens, and now in the OD space. I'd love to hear your journey on this very topic. And in particular this year, I think there's been some fascinating work that you've been excitedly tasked with. So I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction. So Liane, earlier you had mentioned this being a human issue. And I think that, when you ask what's your kind of perspective and how has it led to the work, I think for me, the heart of it starts at it being a human issue. And so diversity and inclusion has been components of my own lived experience. And then certainly the ways that those things, my consideration of how it's impacted others, then informs the work that I've been able to do within the community or the organizations in which I have the opportunity to work for. So a few kind of key pivotal moments came up in my mind from a human experience perspective that I wanted to share. When I was younger as an Indo-Canadian, I had worked so hard to bridge communities between our elder generation and the younger ones who really wanted to feel a sense of belonging. In my case, I knew that I wanted to understand my culture, but I also felt conscious or silly about not being able to speak as fluently as others or have a clear understanding of what culture meant to me. That part of my heritage meant to me. But what I did know that myself and many other youth in our community wanted was a sense of belonging. Another key moment for me, or pivotal kind of aha, was while at UBC and majoring in history, focusing specifically in racial and political history, 1865 to present. I was always hyper aware of my family's experience in Canada, having been made possible due to the relentless sacrifices of Black and Indigenous communities, both in Canada and the US. And so it really begged me to not only respect, but pay attention to that and ask questions. And not just of those particular community groups, but of all the community groups or all the issues and initiatives that come up under that umbrella of diversity and inclusion. And then a really, I think, special experience occurred while practicing HR in BC. I had an opportunity to act as an HR advisor for an organization that looked to transform lives by creating jobs and providing healthy food options for people living in Vancouver's downtown east side. They were committed to employing residents with barriers to regain confidence, skills, and economic independence. What was interesting about that experience is, it kind of felt artful in the space of acceptance and accommodation in a way that I had never experienced before. And what it demonstrated was the ability to do this while maintaining viable business. So this brings me to present day. So what happened at CVI Health? We are a national interdisciplinary network in healthcare of healthcare professionals and support professionals with over 12,000 employees spread across Canada. And earlier this year, the world was on fire over issues of racism experienced in the US from George Floyd, or here in Toronto with Paquette. And the socio-political climate forced people and companies to take a position. Where did you stand on the matter of race and racism? And as Laura had mentioned earlier, what a predicament for some organizations to be in. You couldn't exactly choose silence, and you needed to be really thoughtful about what it is that you did say. Our CEO, John Hantho, for the first time in the organization's history, chose to take a position, but it was a thoughtful one, where it acknowledged we had a journey to go on, and it encouraged people to connect and to have discussions. And it committed to the type of action that showed that we were aware that we had a long way to go on this, and there was a lot of work that needed to be done. What was also great about this is that I felt our leaders, were able to also acknowledge that this issue happened to be a trend on current or current for some, but for a lot of people, this was nothing new. This was yet another tiring moment in a journey that truly just needs to be done already. And so I think that when you consider the work that you're doing is to be really conscious of that human element on it. This impacts people in really different ways. And you got to figure out how to meet people where they're at while also trying to have a bit of a vision around where it is you want to go. So working alongside my leader, our CPO, Laura Root, We were then tasked with the development of a diversity and inclusion strategy, and kind of within weeks asked, so tell us, what's the strategy? What's the big plan for how to get there? And our response was simply, we won't know until we involve our people. And so what we set out to do over the next couple months was preliminarily conducting a D&I census. We cannot serve our people unless we know who our people are. We then posted for a diversity and inclusion advisory committee, a table of folks with lived experience to amplify the voices needed at our ELT table to drive informed decisions and change policy and practice. We committed to organizing focus groups representing various members of the community to validate the advisory committee's mandate and really find out what it's like to work at CDI Health from a diversity and inclusion perspective, and what they'd want to see happen if D&I was honored within their employment experience, and to result us being the best place to work in healthcare. So our committee now comprises of folks across nearly every business segment and community group, and will support HR in the development of an informed strategy for 2021. Focusing on simple, quick wins to make immediate impact, continue building on that momentum, building trust of people that we're actually going to do something about it. Support grassroots local community efforts so that this doesn't end up being it's working on a tower somewhere in Toronto movement, as opposed to how's it's really impacting my day-to-day life working at this organization. Balanced with complex, longer-term initiatives to make lasting impact. So next week, we update our national network on our efforts to date. So pretty excited. We're going to be sharing the results of our D&I census. We're going to meet as a committee for the first time. Collectively as a group, we are inspired. We are equally excited to do all the good stuff. We are super nervous about the mistakes we're certainly going to make along the way. And are committed to enthusiastically taking kind of one step at a time to learn, take accountability, and make change as a national team.
Thank you, Anjana. And, you know, when we spoke recently about your journey, I was so impressed by a few different things. So one is this recognition that, you know, I've heard from some organizations, it's a check the box, you know, train others because it's everyone else's problem. And what I've loved about your approach is like, let's pause and really make sure we have a true understanding of what our organization needs. And I think that's fabulous. The second piece you talked about is that combination of short-term and long-term. So you get some quick wins, but there's really that longer-term view, which I think is fantastic. As we get to Q&A, I'd love to hear some do's and don'ts, so stay tuned for that. Thank you, Anjana. Andrea Carter, I would love to pass it over to you. You bring close to 20 years experience really focusing on the broader topic of diversity and inclusion. And like Rob, your research started in the gender space, but has certainly evolved into broader diversity. And your perspective brings in the neuroscience perspective and some of the work that you've done through Harvard X as it relates to neuroscience. So I'll pass it over to you to share your perspective, particularly as it relates to belonging.
Thanks, Liane. So a pleasure to be here with all of these esteemed panelists. It's wonderful. Laura, you know, when I was listening to you, I was nodding my head incessantly there, and Anjana and Rob, the same thing. You know, I think we're all in alignment with what EDI is looking like and how important belonging is right now. For me, I've been steeped in the research for at least 5 years now. I've done a number of different studies where I've been brought into corporate workplaces to actually assess and look at what's happening from a gender perspective. And one of the places that we've always struggled is that compounding pressure actually changes the way that people lean into situations. And as we've seen with what's happened with the pandemic and of course, George Floyd, is that our nervous systems are so overtaxed right now that there is a defensive responsiveness that we are in. And so that knee-jerk behavior is something that we're seeing consistently across the board, that we need to help organizations and leaders, tone that down so that we can speak to these elements from an open perspective. So one of the pieces that my research has shown, and we're actually opening up a much broader, it's a big belonging study that we are starting. Well, I'm starting as part of my master's in organizational and industrial psychology, is to look at belonging and to look at how many corporations have employees that feel like they belong. Based on the preliminary work that I have done, we're seeing that 7 out of 10 organizations do not have organizations where employees feel like they belong. And that's actually supported by the research from Gartner as well. So we're seeing the consistency across the board based on the work that I'm doing in-house, as well as the larger current data that's available to us as Canadians. So one of the things that I have noticed through the work over the past 5 years specifically is that one of the greatest roadblocks to equity, diversity, and inclusion is defensiveness. And defensiveness is the biggest threat to advancement, to growth, to creating culture that thrives. And that's why, when we're talking and strategizing about EDI development, there's a skill. There's a skill that goes into being able to have difficult dialogues that reflect and integrate new information. And this is a skill that has to be learned. This isn't a skill that everybody has right now. It's amplified right now, and you feel the pressure that you need to have this right now. But inevitably, terms like power, privilege, fragility, they're coming up. And those words are creating both an emotional and a physical reaction. And those words create defensive signals within the brain that cause people to disengage. That's what we're faced with right now. That's really, if we're looking at belonging and we're looking at coming into the organization so that we are creating equality, so that people feel that they have psychological trust and that they can be uniquely themselves and be valued for that. We have to be able to get over that physical defensive reaction that's occurring within the brain at a level that's not necessarily recognized cognitively, because the brain believes it's under attack and it shuts down. So instead of EDI being effective, that's where we've created these elements where initiatives are a have to have rather than a want to have, because it becomes something where the check mark is easier than unpacking the complexities and the discomfort of conflict. Mm-hmm. And if we look at larger organizations, what we come to understand is that conflict has not been something that has been taught. We are not equipped in this day and age to handle conflict so that it's brought forth and worked through. Conflict is something that is experienced and then often swept under the rug. And unless it is, a policy or a procedure or something where somebody has had a social justice issue, it often doesn't get unpacked. And that's where psychological trust becomes very problematic, because now we're seeing that this is no longer okay. And employees are calling out the fact that this cannot continue. So the key to creating effective EDI strategy and organizational change that leads to a culture of belonging is to start by helping people stay out of defensiveness and dampen the feeling of being attacked. And that happens by setting up standards of learning that help people out while they're having these difficult conversations. So that would essentially be the first part, and why I feel that understanding the neuroscience of belonging is so effective, because it takes people out of feeling like they're blamed and moves them into a place of learning and empathy. And that is the only place that we can truly grow and move forward from. Without coming from that place, this is just going to become another checklist, which is something we want to prevent, because as Laura had indicated, that's where we're going to end up with a lot of organizations in hot seats. So from a neuroscience perspective, belonging is one of the top human needs. Belonging exists, when belonging exists within the culture, learning, growth, and engagement occurs. Similar to what Rob was saying, people lean in and they get pulled in to the organization, and that ends up creating positive endorphins and neurochemicals, and there is an increase in usable physical energy within the brain and the body. So from an organizational perspective, that's why creating a culture of belonging is beneficial, because it leads to greater productivity and an increase in fulfillment, which causes the brain to want more, but also to want to do more. And these are elements that we don't see when we have diversity, but we don't have inclusion. And that's primarily what we have seen over the past 6 to 7 years of EDI concepts. So when we look at how the brain responds to exclusion, separation, even integration versus belonging, what most people don't understand from a very simplistic perspective is that it actually creates a pain response in the brain. So there is a physical pain response that occurs when people are excluded. And this is what, and why culture unravels when you have diversity without inclusion. And
I'm sorry to cut you off for a moment
that's
here.
okay.
I just want to underpin the essence of that, which is, creating an organization that's equipped to handle conflict creates that psychological safety. And I think if we look at that definition as our culture is defined by the worst behavior we're willing to tolerate, it also suggests that we can start to share feedback with each other in a place of humility and acceptance that we might be wrong, and we're all on that learning curve, which I think is so fascinating. If you don't mind, I'm going to segue into our questions, because we've got some really good questions coming in from our participants here. By very nature of the title, it is rapid fire. So I would love quick responses, great advice coming through. And Laura, I'm going to pass it over to you first. And there is a question coming in that talks about corporate diversity statements. This is what many organizations are considering. What are your recommendations around it? Any great examples that you might offer? What is your perspective on that, Laura?
Well, again, my perspective is that the any kind of corporate diversity statement has to represent the realities, but also has to be authentic, and there really should be vulnerability to it. So the one thing that I really loved about what Janice shared was the fact that her organization essentially said, look, we don't have it all right now, right? And that, acknowledging that it is a journey. And in some senses, it's not even a journey, it's an odyssey. Right? Because there really isn't a destination. I mean, even on this panel alone, there's so much we're learning from each other. So the key things are really to be intentional and really to not overstate something that doesn't reflect your reality. One thing for organizations that is a really good resource is the Ontario Human Rights Commission has a policy on race and racism. And they even have some frameworks with respect to how you can set up a diversity statement, how you can structure a statement on what you won't tolerate. So there's some good guidelines there, but really for me this morning, what I would say is make sure that, it's authentic, you show your vulnerability, and that you're clear that this is a work in progress, and that it's not, while it may be top down, everyone has a hand in making sure that the environment gets to whatever the organization is stating as its objective.
Very helpful, and thank you for those resources. There's actually a few questions coming in about resources, so we'll follow up with whatever resources we can gather as the next step. Thank you. So the next question, I think, will be well positioned for both Rob and Anjana. So a question or a statement saying, would love to understand best practice or frameworks for launching ERGs for the first time and help to keep them strong. So Rob, do you want to take that first, and then we'll pass it over to Anjana?
Sure. So what, again, I have a lens, right? That's looking at these relationships, and I always say I'm the boy with a hammer. And so it's one dimension in here. But what we can see, and I think this also applies, Anjana, to the broader point you're making too, about how do you drive the change around these ideas, is when you look at networks this way, you can see typically 3 to 5% of the people account for 20 to 35% of the value added collaborations in most places. So a small set of people really matter, and usually companies are unaware of about 50% of them. If I ask the leaders to guess ahead of time on who these people are, or we look at the talent list or things like that. So what we found is, if you are, conducting the analytics first, it's a very simple, very quick process, different ways to do it. That's all, free and out there. You can very quickly understand who this small set of people are. And a lot of times they're not the leaders that people knee-jerk reaction to. You know what I mean? They're different people that actually have trust built locally and things like that. The really critical influencers we find are not connected within one group, but they're bridging groups, like Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point people. If you get them, then you've got people that have credibility in each group, but they're also in the white space. So they're not the top of mind people, you know what I mean, that we think about. So what we can find is, if you do things like this, then you take the investments of effort, or just ways of getting people together, and ask the 3 to 5% to organize a couple of things where they're sharing ideas that others are enthused about, and then to reach out and grab 2 people on the edge and pull them in. That you typically have about a 35% improvement with very little effort. You know what I mean? It's just kind of leveraging the influence that kind of exists, in there. Same thing applies with company initiatives. Right? If you're trying to get stories told, or other things like that, finding some of these influencers and allowing the culture to emerge through them, versus the typical thing where it's, all the leaders go to an offsite, and if they're particularly progressive, they're inviting 20 or 30 other people, but they don't know, they're guessing, right? They're taking their favorites. And so it's a different way of kind of thinking about that. So that's
Great.
one idea.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Rob. Anjana, how about for you?
Yeah. So for us, what we did is, as I think Rob mentioned this, like, not kind of defaulting to people that we think, should be a part of it. And so to make sure that we didn't do that, we actually put out a call across our national network. So no doubt some questions came up around, are you for real about opening this up to 12,000 people? And the answer was absolutely, because you can't build people believing in you that you're meaning to serve them if you're not asking them to join you. And so what we did, and what we plan to do, rather, as it relates to the employee resource group in this particular situation, is first go to those folks who applied for the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Committee that didn't get through. And so what we have promised to do is find many different ways in which to make sure we engage people. So let's go to those individuals who not only represent those groups, but are so passionate, so compelled, that they've already put their hands up to say, I'm in, I want to be a part of that movement. The other thing that we're looking to do is to use our subject matter expertise to support these folks in being successful. Mm-hmm. So instead of, as an example, this seems like it falls in HR should lead this, saying, we have skills in organizational development, so why don't we support by providing the knowledge scalability to effectively programatize and execute against this particular thing. Yeah. So what we would be then focused on doing is providing consultative advice, advisory advice, toolkits, how to measure, how to provide communications through templating, that sort of thing.
Thank you, Anjana. And I can't help but think that toolkit piece would be really important. We think about meeting culture in its general sense needs to be disrupted. How are we getting more diverse thought in our meetings and let the loud voices calm and the quiet voices emerge? So I think preparing those groups on how to actually conduct meetings and get those voices heard, I think is great. So thank you. Question for you, Andrea. There's a question about EDI training. Is it recommended to mandate that for leaders, and good practice to tie to PMP? So I'll share that with you, Andrea, and perhaps Laura, you have some comments on that as well.
Yeah, so there's, there really isn't a one size fits all, but I would say that there's kind of 5 steps when it comes to training and looking at setting up practices that work. And you can download a high-level handout at bit.ly/create belonging. And these are listed there. But the first step is to survey your people. You know, just like Anjana had said, you know, you really have to look at where you're starting at. You need a base level. You need to understand what they're feeling so that you can actually start building trust. And from that, step one, you're going to move into creating an environment built on psychological safety and trust, which comes from looking at your cultural norms. And a lot of those cultural norms are going to come up in the survey that you're likely not aware of. The third, you know, I think Laura had already indicated, it's top-down training. That has to be consistent, because what you're saying and how you're communicating to your people has to also integrate with the norms that you've also established. And when these don't integrate well, that's where you're actually doing more disservice and creating more issues within the culture than doing good, which is where, you know, jumping that gun and taking things slowly and only looking at making small changes to start that are actionable and can be tracked, those are where you're going to get the most positive impact from. Make sure that you create an EDI purpose, mission, and vision, and that is communicated often and always, and then ensure that your mission matches your norms. Those are by far the best strategies that have been working and that we've seen the biggest impact with.
Thank you, Andrea. That's fantastic. And Laura, anything you would comment to that as well?
That was very insightful. I mean, I absolutely echo everything Andrea said. One thing I would add, which actually is, again, echoing, is when it comes to this subject matter, you know, one of the things organizations have to be mindful of is, you know, progress is incremental, and you really have to socialize that within the environment. When it comes to actually tying training or development, as it may be, to any type of performance management of leaders, I think you've got to be, again, as Andrea said, one size doesn't fit all, but you have to be careful in the sense that I do think that if you are intentional and meaningfully trying to, you know, move the markers when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion in an organization, then you do need to measure, and you do need to monitor, and you do need to make sure that whatever standards and expectations that naturally go with improvement in this area, that, you know, they are consistent and consistently applied. But to tie it to immediately to, okay, you know, you have to, this is a must, and you must, you know, go through this, you might be signaling the wrong thing. I think that at the leadership level, naturally, any organization that's embarking down this path, it really, you know, in line with it starting at the top, you have to educate from the top. So instead of, you know, the big stick approach, we really should appeal to each other's humanity and the fact that this is the right thing for everybody in the workplace and in society generally. So there are different ways of maybe incentivizing and also inspiring certain behaviors that are in line with where organizations need to go in terms of improving.
Thank you. And that word incremental, I think, is so important. Thank you very much. And I think, you know, I could spend all day with the four of you. My goodness. So many great insights from today's panel. What I would like to reiterate is that as a follow-up to today, thank you, Andrea, your 5 steps of belonging. We will absolutely send out. Thank you, Dr. Bob. You have a wonderful white paper that looks at the power of networks and how to create that from a push and pull strategy. So we'll absolutely share that. Laura, I'm going to fight for the WTF, but we thrive together. Getting that podcast, some really great insights there. So
Awesome.
We'll absolutely follow up that. The other piece, and there were some questions to the Q&A. We do a lot of work with Fuel 50. They have some really great articles and insights as we look at recruitment and talent practices and how we can look at creating some rigor around AI. So I'll follow up with that piece as well. So I want to take a moment to thank all 4 of you for your wonderful contributions today on such an important topic. I also want to thank all of our attendees and the great questions that came through. I'll invite you to some of our upcoming sessions. So we do have a Mapping Your Path to Retirement session coming up next month, and a recruitment session in December, which no doubt we'll touch on some of these topics, and we'll answer some of your questions in the Q&A as well. Wonderful. As a reminder, we will send the session recording today along with other materials that we've described. You'll also have the opportunity to share your feedback, and we want to hear from you if there's any other upcoming topics that you want to make sure we touch on in our Top of Mind series. I want to wish you all the best and great success as we tackle this really important topic in organizations. I think from the panelists, what we've heard is this importance of taking a broader strategy, looking at all the players that are involved, reimagining how we're gathering insights. And, you know, when we think about, thank you, Laura, you talked about how do we measure some of this. I think we need to measure it frequently, and I think we have to look at different ways in measurement. There's a lot of, you know, great surveys as we look at inclusion, but that belonging piece is a bit of an enigma and takes a different perspective in terms of understanding how that's actually showing up. And I think that combination of qualitative and quantitative feedback will be most important. So thank you, everyone, on behalf of the Talent Company. We really appreciate your time this morning and wish you a great rest of your day.